Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. As the Ukraine war nears its 3-year mark, world leaders and diplomats are scrambling for solutions. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy met his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Ankara, just as the US and Russia kicked off talks in Riyadh. Both came a day after an emergency European summit in Paris. All this whirlwind diplomacy focused on ending the conflict, but on different terms. With US President Donald Trump back in the White House, Washington's approach to Ukraine has shifted dramatically. Gone are the days of US-NATO coordination, replaced instead by direct talks with Moscow. That's left European allies on the sidelines, with many openly questioning US commitments. Germany's chancellor warned that weakening US-European security ties would only benefit Vladimir Putin. Zelenskyy has rejected any negotiations that exclude Ukraine and renewed his call for a European army. His visit to Ankara comes at a pivotal moment, but can Turkey help broker a lasting peace? And where does this stand on the growing transatlantic divide between the US and Europe? For more, joining me now from Brussels is Jamie Shea. He's a former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General. From Washington, D.C., Eugene Chasovsky, a senior director at New Lines Institute. And from Ankara, political analyst Ivan Starodubtsev. Gentlemen, there's a lot to talk about. A major U-turn by the U.S. with new President Donald Trump saying, well, you know what, this ongoing war with Ukraine, it doesn't work for me, I want peace. Jamie, how are you viewing this paradigm shift in U.S. foreign policy?
Well, it's, of course, very significant indeed. What the United States seems to want to do is to talk to the Russians to get the Russians to the negotiating table. The Russians don't seem to be any great hurry to do this, listening at least to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov arriving in Saudi Arabia yesterday. They seem to want to use this meeting first and foremost to normalize, as Lavrov says, the US-Russia relationship, get sanctions lifted, come in from the cold, start regular talks maybe on nuclear issues and many other things, regional conflicts in the Middle East, many other things besides. So clearly what the Americans are saying doesn't quite tally with what the Russians are saying. And we'll see how they come out after these talks in Saudi Arabia. But of course, for the Europeans, it's very important. If the Americans can use this opening to Russia to really get Russia to come to the table in Ukraine, make concessions, hand back some of the territory, accept a lasting, durable peace, it may do some good. But if it means simply that Putin is going to be able to exercise leverage on Trump and be very much in the driving seat and get the Americans to make the concessions, then, of course, it's going to be dangerous for Europe and dangerous for Ukraine.
Eugene, now, Trump made a lot of campaign promises, one of them, obviously, peace in Ukraine. Now, does he have the influence to be able to cash those campaign promise checks that he made? I mean, can he bring everyone on board? Because it looks like a lot of people are dragging their feet on a possible peace deal.
Right. Well, it's certainly going to be a tall order, but obviously the movement has already been made. Over the last week or so, we saw a number of different, proposals floated out. Russia and the U.S. are obviously meeting right now in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and then Ukraine and the Europeans are essentially, trying to react to this and scramble in order to, enhance their position for any potential deal. But I think clearly the appetite is there from a number of parties to shift what is now, a protracted conflict of not only the last 3 years, but, you can go back for more than a decade. And I think Trump is in a position to at least, change the reality on the ground. What that looks like, what that, final ceasefire or even peace agreement looks like, obviously remains to be subject to negotiations. But I think right now is the time for that type of shift.
Mm-hmm. Ivan, Jamie just said the Russians are in no hurry for peace. Are they dragging their feet, or are they happy with the status quo right now? Or is Putin genuinely interested in brokering a peace in Ukraine?
Actually, first of all, let me say that Trump's coming back to the White House was expected in Russia, and there was a lot of hopes. Let me say openly, because it is not widely accepted in Russian media, but there was a lot of hopes regarding Trump's coming back, Trump's returns, and what we do see now. Those exactly were the steps promised by Trump during his election campaign. What Russia expects now Actually, there is no big expectations, no huge expectation. But what we do see, we started to be heard by the West, by the United States. First time for the last 3 years, we hope that we were heard during the interview, famous interview by Tucker Carlson of the president of the Russian Federation, Putin, when he spoke very much openly about the reasons why it happened. Ukrainian war, what was the reasons? And the reason was far beyond, actually, the situation in Ukraine. So we've been heard that time, and now in Saudi Arabia, there is a continuation of these consultations. Let us say so. Russia actually was not harmed as the West expected by sanctions. I spent a lot of time in Russia, a lot of time in Turkey. And believe me, Russia now, in terms of its economy, in terms of its so-called isolation, is not in the position which the collectivists, how we do call it, try to put Russia in. So there is no reason for Russia to hurry up in this situation. There is a very solid base for the consultation. I do mean here Istanbul agreements. You remember famous one which were signed in March 2022. And there is a starting point for negotiations and very clear Russian position. Russia need a peace. Of course, Russia would like to have a peace. But the question here is what will be the terms and conditions of this peace? How we will meet, how we will be met by the West? Will be understood by the West? Because those are nice things, nice words, and sustainable peace and whatsoever. But what is behind all these words? I think Russia tries now to understand.
So it looks like Jamie and Ivan kind of both agree on that Russia's not in a hurry for peace, that they're looking for, as Ivan said, probably the best deal possible. Now, I want to switch over to Europe. Jamie, you obviously know the Europeans very well, and you've had a lot of dialogue with them in your position, former position at NATO. They seem to be a little shocked, which I'm kind of surprised because Trump made it very clear if he was elected that peace in Ukraine would be high on his agenda. Before I ask you about how relevant Europe is right now, I want to play a statement by U.S. presidential envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, that he just made at Munich Security Conference. And we can play that and you can listen.
Can you assure this audience that Ukrainians will be at the table and Europeans will be at the table?
The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no. The answer to the earlier part of that question is yes. Of course the Ukrainians are going to be at the table. I mean, it would be foolish to say they wouldn't. But when you say at the table, you have to define it. Remember, this war has been going on now. We're heading into the third year. One of the things we haven't really gotten to are specifics.
Jamie, can Trump broker peace without an EU stamp of approval?
I don't honestly believe he can because he's made it clear that he's going to be turning to the Europeans for many things. First, of course, is to provide the peacekeeping force, and I think that's the wrong term, but a reassurance force, military force essentially of European countries, of NATO allies from Europe, to underpin the peace process and make sure that the war doesn't come back. And Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary in Brussels last week, made it clear that the United States itself would not have boots on the ground. So in a way, the credibility of Trump's peace deal, if he's able to achieve one, beyond simply a temporary ceasefire, but really to be a durable peace, the credibility of that, whether Trump succeeds or not and gets the Nobel Peace Prize as a result, that hangs on the Europeans. And the more the Europeans show an ability, a readiness to put that force together, the UK has already sent some signals that it's willing to contribute the force. There was a meeting in Paris on this yesterday. The more the Europeans weigh in, I think the harder it's going to be for Trump to leave them out. The second thing, though, it's not just about this peacekeeping force, which has received all the media attention. The Europeans are going to be involved in the reconstruction of Ukraine, the resettlement of the 7 million Ukrainian refugees that have fled the country. There's the long-term stability of Ukraine via EU membership, at least, even if NATO membership may not not be on the cards immediately. So the Europeans have got a really big stake in this, but they've got to do two things. Number one, they've really got to show the Americans that they bring something to the table and that therefore they have a right to get access. They can pay their way in, to use Trump language. And the second thing is that they've got to find ways of convincing the administration. Once the talks get underway, the first round is in Riyadh today. There's going to be several more rounds. That at a certain stage they should be let in and admitted. But they won't do that if they don't have a unified position.
Eugene, do you think Trump wants to let the Europeans in? And if he does, who on the European continent could Trump work with? Will it be Scholz? Will it be Macron? Will it be Starmer? Will it be Meloni? Does he view a viable counterpart that has the influence also to help with his initiative?
Well, I mean, I agree with Jamie in terms of that the Europeans will be at the to the implementation of any peace agreements. There will be troops, that have been discussed to keep the peace, so to speak, or at least to push back any further Russian advances. And the U.S. has made fairly clear that it's not going to participate directly in that. So that obviously falls on the Europeans. Now, which of the leaders, that obviously remains to be seen. Germany is obviously going into elections soon. The UK has already, as has been mentioned, floated the conditional proposal to participate in this kind of force. So I think this is going to have to be a united front, and that will, I think, strengthen the European position. Clearly, there's a lot of solidarity around Ukraine from throughout Europe to varying degrees, but still very strong in most European countries. So, whether it's Germany, France, the UK, other countries, I think that it'll be key to work with all of them. Not only for Ukraine, obviously, to maintain its security, but also for the U.S. to actually implement. Striking a deal is one thing, but the implementation, I think, will be the key part of this.
Even over the past 3 years, there's been limited dialogue between Moscow and Europe, maybe a little with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, a phone call here or there between Macron and Putin and a couple other leaders, but almost zero dialogue. And Putin recently made some condescending remarks about Europe, basically saying he's not taking him too seriously. Now, if there is a U.S.-Russia reset, will Putin be interested in resetting relations with Europe as well?
The background of the President Putin. He is mentally, and he was mentally, very much oriented to the cooperation with Europe. He considered Germany as a major partner of the Russian Federation in Europe, and try somehow to elaborate very good relations with France, with Italy. You remember very special relations of Russia with Italian colleagues. So of course, Russia keeps being very much Europe oriented, even after these 3 years of big disappointments with the Europe position towards Russia, big disappointments about no desire not to speak, not to understand the reasons why the conflict had happened. The issue is that today, for example, during our program, we use the terms like peacekeeping forces, who should be the part of the European army, whatsoever. But I would mostly focus on something else, about durable peace, about sustainable peace. We have to eliminate the reasons of the conflict, and we have to build another architecture of the security in Europe. So peacekeeping forces, it is a very small part of the conversation, very serious conversation which should be done. And Moscow is ready to discuss with Europe, but for today, because of maybe disappointment in Moscow about European position, we do speak with Americans. We do go to Saudi Arabia and talk there.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to bring another major part of the puzzle into the conversation, obviously the Ukrainians. But before we directly get into Ukraine, Ivan, you touched upon European army, and that's a recent call that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy made, that he wants to see a European army. This is something that French President Emmanuel Macron has long desired. Jamie, that would obviously be in direct competition or a direct alternative to NATO. Does Europe need its own army?
No, I don't think it does, because as you rightly say, NATO exists. It's already an integrated command structure. It's existed for many years, and it has lots of sort of multinational forces already. The Europeans are already sort of working with each other in NATO. For example, if you take my country, the UK, which leads a NATO multinational battalion in Estonia, you've got France, you've got Denmark, you've got other countries that participate in that. There are about 10 countries, mostly European, that serve with Canada in the multinational battalion next door in Latvia. So the Europeans are used to sort of working together. The Brits, for example, lead something called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is an integrated force with the Netherlands and with the Scandinavian countries. You've got the Franco-German Eurocorps. I won't bore your listeners with a long list of these units, but it does sort of show that the Europeans in many cases are working together. And during the Ukraine conflict, many of these countries have formed consortia. For example, the Netherlands working with Denmark, working with Belgium and Norway to provide Ukraine with F-16s, or the Czechs organizing an international consortium to buy 800,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition. So rather than a European army, I don't think that's going to happen. Armies are nationally organized. Nations want to retain control over decisions regarding the use of their forces in peace and war. They don't want Brussels to take this decision through majority voting. So I think the basic units will be national, but I do see, at least in terms of defense production and in terms of these multinational units, more and more integration going forward. But it's important, of course, to do that also with the United States, with non-EU countries like the UK, Norway, also Turkey, an important NATO member state too, and basically try to sort of get better value for money through reducing duplication and through this type of integration. It's the pragmatic approach, in my mind, which is the way to go here.
So while all this whirlwind diplomacy is going on, President Zelenskyy is in Ankara meeting with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Eugene, what do you expect the Ukrainian president to tell Erdogan, and what type of support or contribution could the Turks make right now?
Right. So, as we've seen this diplomacy happening, between the US and Russia and all the lead up to it, Ukraine is doing its part to kind of shore up any kind of partners or allies that it can in order to enhance its own position. And clearly the main thing for Ukraine is to obtain some kind of vital and verifiable security guarantees. Obviously, the preference from the Ukrainian side is NATO membership. The US has made pretty clear that that's not going to happen, at least not anytime soon. So other forms of security guarantees and getting players, obviously the Europeans, but even important countries that have played a role in the conflict, whether that be a mediating role or some kind of support role for Ukraine. So Turkey among them, also the Gulf states. Zelenskyy was in UAE recently. So this is, I think, a very important part. Where Turkey's role comes in is what I mentioned. It's Turkey has proven itself as a viable mediator between Ukraine and Russia, having brokered, along with the UN, the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So, obviously that deal didn't end up lasting, but it was the most important diplomatic agreement that we've seen between Ukraine and Russia thus far since the start of the full-scale war. So whether something like that can be replicated, but also providing, as I mentioned, security support, security guarantees will also be very important for Turkey.
Ivan, I also want to ask you about the role of the Turks, but first I want to play a little soundbite from Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, and then we'll get into the question real quick.
In an ideal world, we would like to see the territorial integrity of Ukraine is preserved in an ideal world. But this is the time of war, and unfortunately, as a result of this war, we have to do some choices, some bitter choices. So this is what they are trying to decide now. What they can take, what they can leave out, what they can delay. I think those are some of the priorities, areas that they are now focusing very much.
See, now the Istanbul deal, the grain corridor deal, the prisoners swap, the meeting between former Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, all these happened with a Turkish footprint. Hakan Fidan also saying some bitter choices. It seems like he understands the reality has changed on the ground as well. What role do you foresee for the Turks, Ivan?
About the Turkish role, you listed it very much precisely and fully, let me say. The list was full. Of course, the grain deal. Of course, the Istanbul Agreement. Of course, Turkish mediating role between Russia and Ukraine in some sensitive issues. Turkey did and contributed a lot to the peace process, let me call it, or whatsoever, between Russia and Ukraine. So the main contribution, I would say, it is the Istanbul agreements, which actually it was widely announced by Russian officials that we consider them as a basis for further negotiations about the peace in Ukraine. There is a reality. Reality is so that 4 regions of Ukraine now, according to the constitution of the Russian Federation, are considered like our integral part, Russian integral part. So it will not be negotiated anyway. There is a bitter reality. We may speak a lot about why it just happened so. We had a lot of agreements with Ukraine, Minsk agreements and whatsoever. But the reality is on the ground, and Ukraine will make a choice. And the choice of Ukraine actually is in Istanbul Agreement, and it is the biggest contribution of Turkey. Turkey is, in many fields for Russia, is a strategic partner in many fields. And also in terms of, for example, Black Sea security. So the dialogue between Russia and Turkey, between Moscow and Ankara will go on for sure. For sure, Turkey will be somehow contributing in the negotiations as a part, which may sit at the same table, both with Moscow and with Kiev, when the turn will come. Now, what we do see, we are now in the stage of somehow consultation between Russia and the United States. It's consultation. And the times for the negotiation with the contribution of Europe, with the contribution of Turkey, with the contribution of Ukraine, I'm sure will come in and hopefully will come soon.
Jamie, let's look a little into the future. Let's say Trump and Putin have reached a deal. What type of compromises are you expecting Ukraine to have to make, and will Russia have to make any compromises?
Oh, well, that's the $64,000 question, of course, but it's the right question. From the Russian point of view, their position is clear. They haven't wavered from it. At least they have the virtue of consistency, and they haven't deviated from maximalist demands. Even as they now get close to starting talks with the United States, they haven't offered, apart from a willingness to make peace, in principle, any particular olive branches. It's still, as was said earlier, the recognition of the annexation of the land that they've occupied. They don't seem to be willing to give anything up. They've already, of course, through the Duma, annexed the 4 provinces, as well as Crimea, back in 2014. And Putin is even talking about more Ukrainian territory as part of the deal, which is unspecified. The second thing that the Russians are talking about is that Ukraine shouldn't join NATO. But for the West, there's a big difference here between never join NATO ever, or at least not for now. And we'll see, of course, where that comes out as part of the negotiations. But I would argue that that was a decision taken by NATO, not by the United States alone, that could only be undone through a consensus in NATO. But Putin is also talking about something which the Americans have never accepted, the demilitarization of Ukraine, so it has hardly any army in future, a Russian-friendly government, Ukraine being drawn into the Russian orbit. Even Trump is still talking about a sovereign, independent Ukraine with a durable peace, and has wanted recently to integrate Ukraine into the American economic sphere by trying to take over 50% of Ukraine's minerals. So it's not quite clear where Putin's wiggle room is going to be, frankly, in all of this. The Americans have said publicly that they're going to have concessions from both sides, and Trump has even warned, particularly through the the Vice President, J.D. Vance, in an article in the Wall Street Journal, Trump has even sort of warned Russia of terrible economic sanctions, like lowering the oil price, or even military action, whatever that means, if Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table ready to make some sort of concession. So there are points where they overlap, but there's a hell of a lot, if I can use that term, regarding the long-term future of Ukraine, where they clearly don't overlap. And that means that I think these negotiations are going to be a lot more difficult and a lot more protracted than the sort of quick and dirty piece that President Trump, in 24 hours was talking about during his election campaign.
Eugene, I want to ask you about China as well. Now, obviously, they're watching from afar what's going on. The Russia-Chinese relationship has gotten much stronger over the past 3 years. Is U.S. President Donald Trump viewing this possible reset with Russia as a means to wean Russia away from China, or at least bring it a little closer to the Western camp, even though obviously it'll never be fully accepted as part of the Western camp? Just put a little wedge between, a little divide between Beijing and Moscow?
I do think that the Chinese role is an important one to consider here. Obviously, they're not playing an active role other than just proposing mediating between the U.S. and Russia. So obviously, I don't think that's going to take on a significant form. But when considering China, and just on the question that you last asked in terms of what is the type of concessions that Russia could provide in such a negotiation, I mean, the Ukrainian concessions are clear, in terms of no NATO membership, the territory being not retaken. And I think that this is something perhaps quietly that the U.S. would push Russia on in terms of limiting its relationship with China. The Trump administration has made clear that its primary focus right now is China and the Indo-Pacific, which is kind of why they're trying to wind down conflicts in Ukraine and also to some extent in the Middle East as well. I don't think it's realistic to think that Russia is going to become allied with the U.S. or break off relations with China completely. That relationship is quite robust, but there are, I think, certain elements that the U.S. is looking for in order for Russia to limit that relationship with China. Now, whether that happens through negotiation or through punitive measures like sanctions and trade restrictions, I think will be a subject of the ongoing negotiations that we're seeing currently.
Ivan, I want to end the conversation where I began it, between Trump and Putin. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin, in the past, he said that, U.S. presidents come and go. They come with the best intentions until men in black suits come in the room, and then all of a sudden they revert to their default settings, which is anti-Russia. I even asked the same question to Kremlin spokesman Peskov at the BRICS conference. He kind of laughed and gave me a "we'll wait and see" answer regarding Trump. So I want to ask you, does Russia feel that they finally have an honest broker in Donald Trump as a U.S. president?
Actually, a very good example of the answer by Mr. Peskov. Maybe I also should smile and say we will see and whatsoever. But I am not a diplomat, and I'm not a speaker of Kremlin, so I may speak more openly. In Russia, there is a realism. I would like to believe that about the point that American presidents are coming and going, and we should not rely in bad things, in good things, on just one American president. There is American interest and there is American policy. And we should take into consideration that what had happened over last 3 decades between Russia and the United States should not be forgotten in one moment of negotiation in wherever it happened, in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey, whatsoever. It should not be forgotten. And there is a very wide acceptance about this in Russia. And just this negotiation should not bring Russia to the point of somehow reloading our relations because of that with China, with Iran, or with Northern Korea. This is not a reason. But by its steps, I do believe that the West could actually turn Russia in its sides more by taking out sanctions and whatsoever. And it is in Western interest in doing that, because there is no another way to turn Russia towards Western side. So coming back again to your question, should Russia rely on Trump presidency, and should we open our heart to the new American administration. No, we do speak about interest and long-term interest and about sustainable peace. Sustainable peace may be reached under just one condition. Russia is heard by the West, and the Western countries understood the reason why it happened, and the reasons were eliminated. It was not about troops, peacekeeping forces, and whatsoever. And those remarks about NATO, that one day Ukraine may be in NATO, but not today, for sure they are not acceptable for Russia. And I do believe that they may be a stop factor for any negotiation between Russia and the United States and between Russia and the West.
A lot of high-stakes diplomacy to come. I'm sure we're going to be talking about this topic a lot in the future. Jamie, Eugene, Ivan, thanks for joining me. Thanks for your commentary.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.